This is the 5th lecture on Text Unit 7, which is on molecules and bonding. This lecture is about polar molecules. All right. We have seen, or have looked at, polar bonds, which are determined by the electronegativities of the atoms. For example, here's a bond where A is more electronegative than B. A and B are bonded together. Since A is more electronegative, it will pull the electrons in the bond toward it and be a more negative atom, while B will be a more positive atom. And by more negative and more positive, I mean partial charges, not that A and B become cations and anions. So if we know electronegativities, we can quickly determine if a bond is polar. How can we tell if a whole molecule is polar? Sometimes an entire molecule, as we shall see, can act like a dipole. Right. To analyze molecules for polarity, we need to know about polar bonds, which we've just seen is about electronegativity, and molecular shape, which just got discussed in terms of VSEPR theory in the previous lecture. Let's consider water, which we've seen is a molecule with 4 pair groups on the central atom. Only groups on the central atom, not outer atoms count. There are 4 groups, so the groups are tetrahedral, and the molecule is bent. And we've seen this picture of the molecule's shape before. Tetrahedral groups, bent molecule. Now, so let's draw a picture with of water with the correct molecular shape and add the bond dipoles into the picture. Okay, these bond dipole vectors point toward the more electronegative oxygen atom. Here is a tip. Hydrogen and carbon have the same electronegativity. So if these have the same electronegativity of a carbon atom, we know oxygen's more electronegative than carbon because it's to the right on the periodic table. We expect oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen as well. So oxygen is more electronegative and the bond dipoles point toward oxygen. Shown here, added into the bent molecular shape of water. Okay, here is our picture again. Dipole vectors can always be separated into 2 perpendicular parts. Here, this diagonal dipole is shown as made up of a horizontal and vertical part. And this leftward pointing dipole has a horizontal part in the opposite direction and a vertical part. There are 2 upward pointing vectors which will combine here and here. The rightwardness of this dipole will cancel the leftwardness of this dipole, and these 2 vectors will combine or have a net vector which simply points up. The molecule is polar, and the net dipole, which comes of combining these bond dipoles, points in the direction of oxygen. Again, the upward parts combine, the rightward and leftward parts cancel each other out, and we combine these 2 dipoles to make one. Okay. Now consider carbon dioxide. First, you should be able to draw a Lewis structure and determine the shape. Do you think that it's polar? Try to analyze it like water was analyzed. Answers on the next slide. Carbon dioxide is nonpolar. Here's a correct Lewis structure. 2 groups on the central atom. They're both double bonds. Remember, double bonds count as 1 group. And we predict from VSEPR theory that the molecule is linear. Since oxygen is more electronegative than carbon, bond dipoles point from the carbon to the oxygen atoms. Okay, so we've got two bond dipoles in the molecule. Here, well, again, we seek to combine them like we did in water. Here, the blue points in the opposite direction in the red, and these two oppositely pointing vectors cancel one another out. The CO2 molecule, in spite of having polar bonds, is a nonpolar molecule. Alright, let's try a couple more. BF3 and SO2. Draw Lewis structures, determine the shape, and see if you can analyze them for polarity and determine whether or not the molecules are polar. Alright, attempt both of those before moving on. Alright, BF3 is a trigonal planar molecule. Here's a correct Lewis structure. Boron is an exception to the octet rule. Here are the hour atom fluorines. 3 groups on the boron, they're all bonds, so we predict a trigonal planar shape, which is drawn over here. If you draw a trigonal planar shape and insert dipole vectors, you produce something like this. One upward, one toward this fluorine, one down to the left, one down to the right. You can combine dipoles in pairs, so let's combine these two. The downward parts of these combine, whereas one has a leftward part, which cancels the rightward part of the other. The net result of combining these two is a dipole pointing down. That and the one pointing up cancel each other, so that this molecule as a whole is nonpolar, even though it had 3 polar bonds. And note again that the bond polarities point toward the fluorine. Fluorine is more electronegative than boron. But again, the molecule itself has no positive and negative ends because the dipoles cancel. On the other hand, SO2, which also has 3 pair groups, is polar. There are 3 pair groups, 2 of them are bonds on the sulfur atom, so it's a bent molecule. Here's a bent shape for SO2 here. Bond dipoles point away from the sulfur toward the oxygen. The downward part of each of these will combine. Leftward part cancels rightward part. So the dipole for this molecule points straight down. We predict sulfur is the positive end. These 2 oxygens are the negative end. Net result is, again, the molecule is polar. In the event of 3-dimensional shapes, analysis becomes more complex as visualization does. Let's look at CCl4, carbon tetrachloride. Here's a correct Lewis structure with 4 bonds on the carbon. Alright, so this molecule assumes a tetrahedral shape, and I have marked in to the bonds red arrows which indicate the directions the dipoles are pointing. Chlorine is more electronegative than carbon. It is below carbon on the periodic table. It is also to the right. In this case, you'd have to actually look at a periodic table or listing of electronegativities to determine that chlorine is more electronegative than carbon. But it is, and hence the bond dipoles point toward chlorine. Alright, so you have one pointing up and these 3 pointing down in a pyramidal type of arrangement. These 3 bottom ones combine to form this one that points down. And then the top and the bottom dipoles cancel. CCl4 is a nonpolar molecule. SF4, remember from our previous lecture, has 5 groups on the central atom. one is a lone pair. So the geometry of the molecule is seesaw, and here is a seesaw shape shown here. In this case, fluorine is more electronegative than sulfur. You should be able to determine that from a periodic table. Plus, we know fluorine is the most electronegative atom. Right. These two bond dipoles point upward and downward, and hence cancel each other out. Right. And so we have these two, one of which points off to the right and is, of course, sticking out of the screen, and one pointing off to the left and sticking back into the screen. The net result of combining these two is one that points like this, right between these two sulfur-fluorine bonds. So this is a polar molecule. Over here is the negative end, and here is the positive end. All right. We've seen that determining if a molecule is polar means drawing a Lewis structure, getting the correct shape, and being able to visualize that shape and carefully analyzing how dipoles cancel and combine. If all the dipoles cancel, it's nonpolar. If there is a remaining dipole from combination, it's a polar molecule. This concludes the 5th lecture for Text Unit 7.